Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Here in the grass borders, I try and let it look as natural and as free as possible, and we very often don't mulch it. You usually only mulch it about once every 3 years, but that does mean that we get weeds in here. And some of them are actually quite welcome. The lesser hemlock and the cow parsley can look lovely. Others, like the cleavers and the nettles and some of the thistles, are not so welcome, and I have to get in here and weed, sort of sifting my way through the growth. Now, this spring has been an absolute joy in terms of the weather, as good as I can remember for ages. But spring is coming to a close. And in tonight's programme, we are going to look forward to all the floral glories of the coming months. Carol revels in the joys of the peony, one of the early stars of summer. Nick has the ultimate guide to the nation's favourite flower, the rose. And Adam visits a garden in the Cotswolds bursting with colour from tender perennials. The jewel garden is quite slow to get going in spring. It's probably the last piece of Longmeadow to really start showing its floral colours, but when it does get going, it goes on the rampage. And one of the plants that to me is a great signifier of the shift from spring to summer is the tree peony. Now this is Peonia lutea. The colour of the flowers, this bright clear yellow, is really strong and sings out, and it's slightly hidden by the leaves, but I like that. It's really a good border shrub if you've got the space to accommodate it. Now, the peonies have a slight reputation of being temperamental and tricky, but that's largely unfounded, and they are one of the glories of early summer. And a couple of years ago, Carol went to Spetchley Park and celebrated the extraordinary range of peonies growing there.
Summer's finally arrived. There are leaves on the trees, everything's growing. And then suddenly, out of the blue, the peony bursts on the scene with these great voluptuous flowers in crimsons, pinks, yellows. She's the true glamour girl of the early summer garden. In the wild, peonies come from a variety of different locations, all across the Northern Hemisphere. In China, they were particularly revered, and it was there that 4,000 years ago, the cultivation of the peony truly began. Later, the Japanese took the peony to their hearts, finessing its cultivation and using it as a motif in a variety of art forms. In both cultures, it was regarded as the king of flowers, representing good fortune and prosperity. Peonies belong to the family Ranunculaceae. That's the buttercup family. There are two main types of flower. On the one hand, there are the doubles with row upon row of petals. On the other, there's the single ones with just one layer of petals around the edge. In the case of the double flowers, as far as a bee is concerned, they're absolutely useless. Even if there is nectar in there, a bee can't possibly penetrate. So, in terms of beauty in the garden, lots of us might go for the showier doubles, but when it comes to insects, they'll go for the single one every time. Although there are numerous different species of peonies, the ones we cultivate in our garden fall into three main types. First of all, there are herbaceous peonies. Secondly, intersectional. And thirdly, tree peonies. And this is a beautiful example of a tree peony. She's called Marchioness, and she's typical. she has really woody growth down here. Tree peonies are shrubs, so all that growth stays above ground and the new growth in the spring will emanate from that woody structure. All of them have this slightly sort of glaucous touch to the leaves, very often pink tinged, and they have these huge, voluptuous flowers, sometimes single, sometimes double, sometimes somewhere in between. They'll grow in sunny places or in slight shade, and all tree peony cultivars are grafted onto a rootstock. And it's vital when you're planting them that that join is under the surface of the soil. Otherwise, the rootstock takes over. The most commonly grown of all these groups of peonies are the herbaceous peonies, which simply means during the winter they will die away to nothing. They'll disappear completely. Now, tree peonies have fibrous roots that spread out, but in the case of these, there are these big tubers. In the spring, up will come new shoots, and each one of them will make a big, tall stem with a spectacular flower at the top. But the whole deportment of the plant is beautiful. They're evenly spaced throughout. And even though their show lasts just a short while, they're spectacular when they're in bloom. They're very easy and straightforward to grow. But one of the complaints that people often have about these herbaceous peonies is that they refuse to flower. It's often when people have moved them, and the problem is that they get planted too deep. What herbaceous peonies need is to have their tubers planted so there's just a tiny depth of soil above them. 1 inch or 2 inches is ample. Any more than that, and they feel buried. They'll produce leaves, but very, very few flowers. And it really is worth treating them properly to get this spectacular display. This exquisite beauty is Peonia Laura Dessert. She's a form of Peonia lactiflora, the main herbaceous peonies that we grow in our gardens. In recent times, peonies like this have become incredibly popular florist flowers, and especially in bridal bouquets. No wonder, they're absolutely scrumptious. This is the third type of peonies that we grow in our beds and borders. It's an intersectional hybrid. It's called Bartzella. These peonies were introduced in the 1940s by Mr. Ito, a Japanese botanist, who wanted to marry the benefits of both tree and herbaceous peonies. He succeeded wonderfully, but he never knew about it, because he died before the first ones flowered. Since then, they've become extremely popular because they don't need staking. They produce masses of glorious flowers, and often that flowering is prolonged because they make extra buds too. What more could you want? The dramatic display that peonies provide may only be there for a short time, but whilst it's fleeting, there's nothing else like it. They're the true shooting stars of early summer.
There is no doubt that peonies are just fantastic, but it's getting a crowded field. As summer opens out, more and more wonderful plants are coming to the fore. But before all that happens, the species roses in the spring garden are just lovely. Now, species roses are those that are not bred by man. They occur naturally in the state that we see them in the wild. And they are really the material from which all other roses are created. And I've got two here in the spring garden. There's Rosa hugonis and Rosa cantabrigiensis, and both are very similar. They share the same lovely primrose yellow flowers. They're small, they're simple. You never get a voluptuous species rose. They don't have long stems. They just grow out like a spray with delicate ferny foliage. They only last for a few weeks. So you may think I'm underselling it, but there is something absolutely exquisite about them, and I love them. Now, species roses are really easy to grow, and in fact, so are most roses by and large, but I know that a lot of people feel intimidated by them, because although they're lovely flowers, they don't quite know when to prune them or what type of rose it is. And a couple of years ago, Nick Bailey made a series of films completely explaining and demystifying the glories of the rose.
The rose is certainly a vast and beautiful genus. The choice for your garden can be very confusing. Today, I'm looking at a class of roses which existed long before modern cultivars, the old roses. And these are best defined as the plants which were first identified before 1860. And some of them are truly ancient, dating back to the great palaces of Rome, Persia, and Egypt. Now, old roses have some pretty distinct characteristics. They tend to come in the pink, white, and purple colour ranges. They're usually quite heavily scented, and the vast majority put on a spectacular display of flower early on in summer. One of the oldest groups of cultivated roses are the Gallicas, and this is a fantastic example. This is the apothecary's rose. It is Rosa Gallica var officinalis, and it's possibly the longest cultivated rose. Now, as a garden plant, it's incredibly useful, not least that it can grow in partial shade, and it also does well in poor soils, which is quite unusual for a rose. Something I particularly love about it is, despite the fact that it's got these near double blooms, they are incredibly open, which means that pollinators can get to them very easily. The other lovely quality it has is this foliage, which has got a sort of dull, muted tone to it, which is a real difference from contemporary roses, which tend to be very glossy. Now, of course, there are other cultivars of Gallica that you can try. There's Versicolor, which is really dramatic with a pink and white stripe, and there are several other cultivars with red, pink and white tones. So overall, it's an incredibly useful garden plant that'll give you a burst of amazing colour early on in the summer. Grown in the Middle East since antiquity, the damask rose really is something special. The thing that makes it unique is that it has the most extraordinary and arguably the strongest scent of all the old roses. So strong, in fact, that it was used to make attar of roses, which of course is one of the scents that you get in Turkish delight. Now, it has particularly useful garden qualities. It makes about a 5-foot plant. It has a sort of dull muted leaf, similar to the Rosa Gallica. But there are many different colour forms you can grow in the garden. There are pale pinks like this, near whites, and then darker pinks as well. Gardeners are often cautious about introducing old roses onto their plots because they have a relatively short flowering window. But I think that fleeting perfection, coupled with incredible scent, means it's worth introducing just 1 or 2 old roses into your garden.
Well, Nick will be returning later in the programme with 2 more types of roses and explanations and tips on how to best grow them. However, there is just one thing I have to disagree with you on, Nick, and that is not that you should have 1 or 2 roses in your garden. You can never have too many of those lovely old shrub roses. Now, I must mistake this delphinium. Delphiniums are one of those plants that I associate with childhood. It's a good idea to stake them, as with all plants, before they get floppy. And I just use bent wire supports around so they've just got something to lean on. I don't try and tie them in, it just means that they won't flop over. And the reason why I associate them with my childhood is because these tall blue spires of flower is something I associate with long, hot summer days a long, long time ago. And I guess we all love them. But I also guess that very few people share the same degree of passionate fervour for delphiniums as Graham Austin. And a few years ago, we went to visit him at his nursery in Hertfordshire.
What I love about delphiniums is their wow factor. One of my favourites is Delphinium Walton Benjamin. So it's this real electric blue with a black and blue striped eye. Absolutely stunning. And if that was at the bottom of your garden, it would show off a mile. It'd look spectacular. There's short varieties, 3.5 foot high, so they're for the smaller gardens. You've got the mid varieties, 5 to 6 foot, so they're slightly bigger gardens. And if you've got an old Victorian wall, you've got the 6 to 8 foot varieties. So yeah, they blend in all different gardens. People think delphiniums are difficult to grow. They're not. They're very tough, hardy perennials. It's getting the right strain of delphinium. And the most popular delphinium is a Pacific giant. It's all right as a delphinium, but it's not a true hardy perennial. Elatum delphiniums is what you need. And most delphinium florets are semi-double, so this is a semi-double. Then we go to the doubles. So they have no eye in the centre, and this is Susan Edmonds. So that's an eyeless double. And then you go on another stage to the rosebud doubles. And this one's Alice Artindale. My parents used to take myself and my brother to a nursery every other Sunday or something like that. And I used to love going into this nursery and the smell of the greenhouse after they'd watered. It was lovely. And I used to take cuttings off different plants. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. My parents' garden is full of old conifers and things that I'd rooted. Love being outside, I love the nature, the birds, the wildlife. So the option for me was to be a nurseryman when I left school, yeah. Well, delphiniums, they're actually an alpine plant, so they love very cold conditions. The colder it is, the better. If that goes down to -10 here this winter, these will not worry about the cold. They go dormant, they rest, and then they've got the energy to produce this great big spike the next summer. A delphinium will begin to flower about mid-June, and it takes about 3 weeks for the whole spike to run out and come in full flower. But I think the actual flowering lasts about 6 weeks because these florets, as they start to open, I think they're as good as a flower. There's some varieties, they glow, and that's as good as any flower to me, anyway. But if you cut the delphinium right down to the ground after it's finished flowering, clear it all out and give it a dose of fertiliser, usually it's September, October, you'll get a good second flowering. They are quite vulnerable to slugs, delphiniums. You've got to keep the slugs off them, especially at the early stages. So we recommend, when you cut down your delphinium for the winter, you cover it with sharp sand or horticultural grit. Some people put it round the delphinium. We actually cover it. It looks like a load of molehills here in the winter. One thing you must do with your delphiniums, either a young or an old plant, is thin them. So in March, April, you'll notice that your delphinium will have, it could have as much as 30 or 40 little stems, they're potential flowers, but that's too many. So you want to thin them out. You just get a knife and you cut them down to ground level and leave the thick ones. In a young plant, you'd leave 3 stems, and as the plant gets older, you'd leave 5, 7 or 9 stems. No more than that, really, and that will give you better flower spikes. Also, it lets the air through the centre of the plant, and that helps with slug control, and it just helps with the overall health of your plant. After you've thinned your delphinium, you want to stake your plant. Now, this is very important. If they're not staked, this main spike will lean over and split the crown at the bottom, and then water will get in and the crown will rot. We use 4-foot canes, and we do 3 as a triangle round the plant. So they're in a cage, really, and they just sway, they hit the string, and then sway back. The one thing you don't want to do is stake each flower spike separately to a cane tightly, because all would happen, the wind would blow and it would just snap. This is my trials area. Now, a lot of these are not really up to scratch at the moment, but this little one here, this is a very tight double, and I'm quite pleased with that one. Doubles are not that common, so this one I'm going to grow on for another couple of years, and if it stays good and keeps producing nice flowers, then hopefully we'll have a chance of naming that delphinium. They're lovely plants, they deserve to be more popular.
I'm going to feed one of the clematis growing here in the jewel garden. This is a liquid seaweed feed, and it's doing 2 things really. One, it's giving it extra nourishment, and 2, a good drink. And those are the 2 things that clematis love. They really do need lots of water, and when you plant a clematis, if you add plenty of bulk, an organic matter into the soil, that acts as a sponge, and they like richness. And if you've got very chalky or sandy soil, you probably will need to feed them fairly regularly, or if you're growing them in a container. Now, actually, they grow very well here, particularly group 3 clematis, and we have them climbing up the wigwams and tripods all over the garden, particularly here in the jewel garden. But this one, I thought I'd give it a boost. And the beautiful thing about growing clematis, particularly the late flowering varieties, which do all their growing in 1 year and then you prune them back hard, is that they give you height. Instant drama and height, and you can grow them in a very small garden. If you've got a wall or a trellis or a fence, or you can get some wigwams into a pot, then you can have a dramatic clematis. And of course it means that with most gardens, you can actually have quite a few different varieties growing. As we found last summer when we visited the garden of Sheila Chapman in Essex.
Once you get hooked on clematis, that's the end of it. You're with them for life. I've always said clematis, should be clematis, and 1 in 10 say fuchsia. I've got about 120 clematis in the garden. It's a good way of going to sleep at night because you can just try counting them all the way round and you've fallen asleep before you've finished. Clematis are so versatile. You can put them up pergolas, through trees, over bushes. You can have the little tiny ones at the edge of the borders. There's just so much you can do with them. When I had the nursery, that was all consuming. It was leaving early in the morning, getting home late in the evening, and then having to do paperwork. And I had 2 years where I only had 5 days off, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I wouldn't have changed it for the world. When I packed up, I bought all the clematis I could that were left and hadn't been sold back to my garden. When you go out to buy a clematis, if you choose the small liners that you can get and are quite cheap, you have to grow them on in a 2-litre pot for about a year until the roots are right the way round, then plant them out, because the stronger the plant, the better it'll perform in the garden. There is a saying that you head in the sun, feet in the shade, but the reason they're in the shade is because it conserves moisture. So long as you water well, they can be planted in full sun. Try to place clematis so that it enhances the plant that's already there. I think every climbing rose has got at least 1 clematis going through it. and I put them up pergolas, over arches, on obelisks, and in the general border, so they mix with other plants. It's just a case of your own personal combination. This is Texensis Princess Diana, shocking pink, outward and upward facing tulip-like flowers, and I grow this on a pergola with the New Dawn rose, so the soft pink and the shocking pink go very well together. And here we've got the rose Catherine Morley, soft pink, and the herbaceous Integrifolia Heather Herschel. And I think you'll agree these look fantastic because you don't have to have clematis just with climbing roses. You can have them with freestanding roses as well. This is one of my favourites. This is Golden Tiara. You have the small, yellow, beautiful flowers with the mauve centre that matches up with Victoria that's trying to attack me over here. It also has lovely buds, usually lime green in colour, and it also goes with a Graham Stewart Thomas rose. These are all my either cuttings or seedlings. 150 of these are the ones that have self-sown. I'm very lucky that I've got clematis seedlings coming up all through the garden, and they seem to see themselves in exactly the right place. This little one here seeded itself many, many years ago, and it's just gone from strength to strength. Another bonus with growing clematis is when the flowers are finished, you've got such wonderful seed heads. If you wish to grow your own plants from seed, you wait until the seeds are dark brown, you put them in trays of half compost, half perlite, cover them with a little bit of vermiculite, water well, and then leave them either in a cool greenhouse, outside on the patio, doesn't really matter, just cross your fingers. This is the large late flowered variety called Carew. I grow it on obelisks, many of which came from the nursery, but it's sentimental reason as well, but they do add height all round the border. As you can see, I've spiralled the stems all the way round so that the plant covers the whole area and it doesn't just go straight to the top and then go flying away and looking a bit weird and wonderful like a triffid. Now with the pergola you have the uprights. It has all the clematis going over, so you've got extra interest. On the back of the pergola with the fence we have the Rose Awakening, which is pale pink and quartered, and when that's out and you've got the clematis as well, you've got these beautiful large purple clematis. It's just one mass of impact of what you can do when you have clematis and roses together and you've got a good support to put them on. I think no garden can be without a clematis or 10, because there's so many different shapes and you can put them with something, so when something's gone over, you've got the clematis to continue with the flowering. Do what you like with them. They're very amenable.
Still to come, Adam discovers a Cotswolds garden with an incredible range of tender perennials. And we visit a passionate dahlia grower in Cumbria. But first, Nick continues his journey through the story of the rose, turning his attention to the repeat flowering bourbon, tea, and floribunda roses.
Bourbon roses first came to prominence in the early 1800s, and they really represent the link between old and modern roses. They have some quite distinct qualities to them. They have these deeply ruffled blooms, which have, the most intoxicating and delicious of scents. But the thing that makes them really worthy garden plants for me is the fact that they repeat bloom all the way through the season. Now, this is a particularly good example of a Bourbon rose. It's Madame Isaac Perrier, and it will do just that. It keeps on blooming from May through to October. Now, in terms of keeping these plants happy and growing well in the garden, it needs to be grown in a classic rose soil, so humus-rich, reasonable amount of moisture, but not too wet, and lots of nutrients, so it needs a good mulch each year of manure. Now, in terms of pruning, over the winter, it needs about a 1/3 reduction. So look down at the bottom there, get rid of one of those old stems, and it will trigger new growth, new stems, and lots of new flowering. The period from the 1840s right through until the 1950s saw a huge expansion in the breeding of different rose groups across Europe. The cultivars produced were the forerunners of many of the roses we grow today. Tea roses, such as Mutabilis, arrived from China in the 1840s. Named after the tea clipper ships, they brought with them the promise of exciting new colours, including yellows and an ability to repeat flower, unlike their predecessors, the old roses. These tea roses were hybridised with other older roses, producing hybrid teas. They started to arrive from France in about 1880, and they followed a quick succession of lots of different colours of these HT roses. Then, directly after the war, a new and iconic rose appeared, and this is it. It's Rosa Peace, and it has this beautiful pink edge to it on the outer petals and then yellow in the centre. And it's gone on to become the best-selling rose in the world. Now, all of these HT roses are probably the easiest of all groups of roses to maintain. They need to be in a relatively heavy soil, lots of mulch, lots of food through the season, and their pruning couldn't be easier. You can literally chop them down to about 8 inches, about 20 centimetres in March time, and they'll grow away for you brilliantly into the season. Now, of course, HTs are repeat flowers that will flower from May to November, but if you deadhead them, you'll keep them going even longer. These are Floribunda roses, and their name comes from the botanical Latin, which literally means multi-flowered. The great thing about Floribunda roses is they repeat all the way through the season. I think the rose that gets me most excited in the Floribunda group has to be this, and this is Burgundy Ice. And I don't think there are many other flowers that have quite this tone. It's that beautiful, suffused burgundy with a pale back to the petal, which really makes the whole thing pop. Modern roses have had a really bad rap over the last few decades, but because of their ability to repeat flower, their incredible range of colours, the fact that some of them are brilliantly scented, and that you can mix them into other borders, I think they are absolutely due a revival.
Ouch! This rose is one of the thorniest I've ever known. It's called Madame Caroline Testoute. And it's not so much the quantity of thorns, it's each one is a sort of razor-sharp dagger, and I always get stuck by it. But it's worth the trouble because it's beautiful. It's a hybrid tea climber, and it's got a mass of big, blousy pink blooms that will repeat flowering most of the summer. And climbing roses are defined by the fact that they produce their blooms on new growth. So when you're training them, you want to get a basic structure of about 5 or 6 good, strong stems that you fan out, trying to get as horizontal as possible on the surface they're trained against. And then the side shoots, which are all this new growth you can see appearing, bear the flowers. You prune them back in autumn, right back to 1 leaf or 2, and then you get a surge of growth and a mass of flowers. With careful pruning, you can keep a climbing rose like this flowering for decades, for a lifetime. But underneath it and all around the dry garden, we have starting to flower in all their glory the bearded irises. In fact, they only really grow well here in this side of the house because the rest of our soil is much too heavy for them. But they're happy here. And like roses, they have this incredible intensity of flower, but there is something delicate about them, something transient. And they are a plant that inspires deep and abiding passions, as we discovered when we went to visit a grower in the Cotswolds.
My name is Anne Milner. I live in Gloucestershire, near Cirencester, and I hold the national collection of irises bred by a chap called Arthur Bliss. The flowers hold a special significance because Arthur Bliss was a very distant uncle of mine, and I came across him when I was doing some family history research with a cousin who offered me a couple of his irises for my then quite large garden. We started finding out about them, we started looking for a few more, and eventually they became a national collection. Arthur Bliss was an engineer. He retired early because he was deaf. I think because he was deaf, he kept himself to himself a lot. Arthur was somebody who really didn't care about what he looked like or anything else. He didn't bother to buy new clothes. I think he was the worst dressed gardener, I think, ever. But on the other hand, his irises he kept in meticulous fashion and kept very precise records. In 1912, he moved from Kent to Morwellham Quay on the Devon-Cornwall border near Tavistock, and he became obsessed with breeding irises. This is the iris Morwell. It is the first iris that was noticed by anybody and therefore was the start of his fame as an iris breeder. It's also the first iris that I got from my cousin. It's a very elegant iris. It's quite large for its age. It's this lovely, delicate mauvey blue, and it smells simply wonderful. The most important flower in Arthur's story is Dominion. There is no doubt whatsoever about that, because that forged his reputation and went all over the world for breeders to use to create new irises. When Dominion was first introduced, it was so special that it was decided to sell it at 5 guineas a rhizome. In today's money, it would probably be about £300. And because it was so expensive, everybody then wanted it because they thought, if you're charging that much for it, it must be really, really, really special. This iris is important because it helped put Arthur on the map as far as iris breeding is concerned. And you can say that in all the ones that have velvety falls, then Dominion will be somewhere in its parentage. Its influence is there right to the modern day. I started collecting these irises in the mid-80s. There are about 170 that he introduced, and I probably have found about 35, 40 of them so far. And the hunt is almost as much fun as the growing. It's very important with old irises to make sure that they don't run into each other, because it's important for me to keep each cultivar very clearly defined so that I know when I'm digging them, which one's which. So I use scallop shells between each clump. To keep irises healthy and not overcrowded, you need to divide them. So you break the rhizomes apart. It's important to divide rhizomes so that the sun can get to the rhizome to bake them, because otherwise they'll get overcrowded and they'll stop flowering. You then need to cut the leaves back. Some people cut the leaves back after flowering, but it's not necessary because the leaves are busy feeding the rhizome, and so the rhizome is growing bigger. You can also cut the roots back, because most of the roots will regrow. It's important to name the rhizome as you do it, because otherwise, if you're doing lots of irises, they can get in a muddle, because all irises look the same when they have no flowers. People are beginning to use old irises in breeding again because a lot of modern irises have lost their perfume, they've lost their elegance, and they want to try and breed some of that back into them. I do feel a connection to my uncle in that even though it's a very, very distant relationship, I feel that if he was able to look down and see what was going on now, he would be really pleased that people are still growing his irises 100 years after he died.
A summer flower I really couldn't be without here at Longmeadow is the dahlia. I love them and have them in many different colours, lighting up the border well into autumn. But in Cumbria, Jack Gott has got a collection of dahlias that is really special.
I've been growing dahlias for, I would say, between 44 and 46 years. I set off with 12 different varieties. Now we have over 350 different types. I'm an electrician by trade. Used to get together at brew times, and one of these lads said, "Oh, I've got some dahlias if you want to give them a try." And that's just how it started. I'm just passionate about them, yeah. The difference of varieties, the forms, there's everything from the dark leaf ones to the tiny ones that only grow 12 inches tall with a flower like a little daisy, to the great big ones that are just full of petal. I've lived in this street all my life. I'm now 68 years old. We have the largest collection of dark leaf dahlias in the UK, and the Dutch people say we've got the largest collection in the world. We've got Grenadier here, which is a bright red one. We've got Fire Mountain. These two are better than Bishop of Llandaff. They're a lot brighter flower, and with the dark foliage, makes it stand out better still. Black Jack is not named after me, as if you might think it is, and you won't see a darker leaf or a darker flower of that type of dahlia anywhere. Well, that tree dahlia is Imperial Iris. It's been in about 4 years. I've never had it to flower yet, but one day it will flower. The roots are that big, I would need a pick and shovel to get them out. I think in time it'll start moving that conifer behind us. There is a lot of colour here, but when you go around the back and see all the colour that there is around there, you'll be gobsmacked. Well, for growing show palms, to start with, you need the right varieties. All flowers and all buds have what they call a calyx, which wraps around the bud to start with. So for a good palm to be shown properly, you need to cut those calyxes off, just take them off like that, and that allows the palm petals to go right to the back of the stem, just like that. Now for showing cactus dahlias or any dahlias you want to show that have got a long stem, you need to be taking these two shoots off like that, and you take the next two off below like so, which will give you a cut flower stem of about 22 to 24 inches. The floral art ladies like them for displays because it gives them a long stem and they can put greenery in between and the flower on the top. I'm raising new collarette type dahlias. The collarette is with the other collar around the centre. And what I'm doing is I'm letting the bees, like that one, it's going from there and then it'll go to there, go to this one and send the pollen onto these. And this is the mother plant, you can say, which is the one that's going to carry the baby seed. You can always tell if a flower is finished because it's pointed. And then for 10 days, I squeeze the water out of them, and that ripens the seed. Then we cut them off, just put them in milk bottles as if it was a flower, leave it there until this has all gone brown, Then we knock the seed out of the pod, save it in an envelope, and then on the 1st of April every year, we sow the seed. Most of them will come single. You may get 5 that are a good collar around them, which this year I would say I have 5 out of 100, which that is good going. Letting the bees do it, it's fantastic. They're doing the work for me. Everybody says it's dahlia heaven.
This and a number of other roses scrambling up the apple trees in the orchard is a rambler. And this one is Rosa multiflora carnea. It's really good if you've got a shady area or a north wall because it will cope with shade and quite poor soil. And it produces a cluster, a mass of these lilac pink flowers. They're fragrant and they festoon the tree. It swamps it. I probably should prune it much harder, but I haven't got the heart. In fact, this is only its 4th year. So every year it gets bigger and bigger. And ramblers can grow truly enormous. They are spectacular roses. The downside is that you only get 1 bite of the cherry for the vast majority of them. But boy, is it worth waiting for. Now, we've come to the 3rd and final instalment of Nick's journey through the story of the rose. And many people would say that he has saved the best to the last.
Arguably the most popular of roses gracing our borders today are the English roses. The man responsible for these is David Austin, a farmer's son who in the 60s was inspired by a neighbouring plant breeder to concentrate on hybridising roses rather than crops. David's ambition was to give gardeners an improved range of roses with full blooms, packed with petals that offer that classic and highly sought-after old rose look with a longer flowering period, health and vigour, and where possible, an attractive scent. This is one of the newest English roses. It's Thomas à Becket, and it really embodies what English roses are. It's got these fantastic full blooms which repeat all the way through the season, and it's got a great scent, which is really old rose, so it's just so charming. But the thing that I particularly like about this cultivar is it's got quite a loose, open habit, so it almost feels like a wild or species rose. Now, in terms of the blooms themselves, well, they've got this delicious sort of crimson look to them, and then they've got this slightly lax habit to the flowers as well, which I think gives it a lovely quality. In terms of growing it in the garden, it's really, really adaptable. It will grow in full sun, as it is here, and equally it will grow in part shade. To have a brilliant display of English roses going all summer, deadheading is key. This is loosely termed as summer pruning. Doing this regularly keeps them flowering and directs the plant's energy into producing new blooms. It's best to remove the spent flowers and around 6 inches of stem to increase the performance of the plant. One of my absolute favourite English roses is this. It's Queen of Sweden, and I think it epitomises everything that's great about the rose. In fact, I think it oozes pure romance. If you see it from a distance, it almost appears white, but as you get closer to it, you see it's got that beautiful baby pink that comes out from the centre and then gets paler as it moves towards the edges of that cupped flower. There's almost a peony-like quality to the massive ruffled petals that are all packed in there. As if that weren't enough, it's also got a fantastic scent. There's hints of myrrh and Parma violet in there, which I think are absolutely lovely. In terms of how you use this in the garden, it's great because you can mix it into herbaceous or shrub borders. I've used it in the past as a hedging plant, but equally it will stand alone. Now, it works brilliantly also as a cut flower. from traditional forms right the way up to modern cultivars. There really is an incredible range of roses out there in terms of colour, form and size, meaning that there's one to suit every single garden. So be brave, try out a new form and celebrate the incredible flower that is the rose.
By the end of May, I can start planting out my summer flowering tender perennials and annuals. There's a huge temptation to put these out at the beginning of May, to move on, to push all that summer intensity a little bit closer. But it's risky. Better just to wait a little bit and then plant them out. And what I'm putting in here is a salvia. This is Salvia amistad. This guy flowers absolutely reliably with a deep, inky purple flower that will start about now and carry on into autumn sometimes. It just goes on. And it's pretty robust too, as salvias go. So I'm going to pop this in. This has been protected over winter. It's been hardened off for the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's pretty dry, but that won't matter because salvias are tough plants. It doesn't hurt to treat them a bit hard, keep them a little bit dry and not feed them too much. Because if you feed it too much, you'll get lots of growth, but fewer flowers. Treat it a bit harder with good drainage and it'll put its energy into producing flowers rather than leaf. Okay, pop that in the hole, it fits perfectly. Firm it in. And now I'll give it a really good water. Now we try and grow quite a few tender perennials, but nothing like the garden that Adam went to visit last summer.
We gardeners do like a yap, don't we? Especially if we find something that we think's a little bit different. I had a mate say, Frosty, you have got to go and visit this garden. Not only is the design special, but the planting and the work that's gone into it will blow your mind. This is Broughton House, a 2.5-acre garden near Morton in Marsh. At first glance, it looks good. But get a bit closer to those borders and there is something really special going on. The amount of tender perennials that just work through and bring it alive. Amazing. Three gardeners create and maintain this amazing space, headed by Jackie Ray. I've had a little walk around this garden. It's like food for the soul. It's incredible.
It's great fun. We enjoy it.
But you've been at, what, 18 years?
Yes. Well, this is my 18th year, so 17 and a half.
And head gardener for 16 months?
Yes.
Using tender shrubs and half-hardy perennials has been the tradition throughout Jackie's time here, bringing an extra blast of colour and form. Because they become your jewels, don't they? They sort of more or less guarantee you colour this time of year.
Yes, it keeps on going and getting better and better. And the end of September, beginning of October, it's fantastic, until the frosts, really.
Wow. In all, the team uses around 160 different types of tender plants here, like this lantana, and lots of aeoniums. All but 1 or 2 are grown on site.
Well, I did do 2,000 cuttings.
2,000 cuttings?
Yes.
And presumably that's just the smaller stuff, whereas some of the bigger stuff gets lifted and taken
Yes,
in?
yes. We always do cuttings of the butylons and the cestrums, so we've got young stock coming on because we don't keep the really big plants.
They lift and overwinter whatever they can carry in up to 40-litre pots. And then in spring, spend a month replanting everything out. including the new plants they've created from cuttings. When you get to the end of May, it must be manic here, isn't it?
Yes, it is quite busy, because that's when we start planting out. Last year, when I was head gardener, we'd get a trailer of plants out, and then I'd run around placing them, and Tom and Gareth would plant them, and then I'd be on to the next lot. So I just spent the months running around.
It's not a bad way to get in your steps, is it? But I love the way that you've detailed this back border, and the way that the movement picks up with trees in the landscape.
Yes, the landscape is fantastic out there, isn't it? It just makes the garden look like it goes on and on. So it's...
No, I'm going the planting, the way that you've planted...
sorry.
No, not sorry, you're just being modest. You're being modest. That just doesn't happen, you know.
I think that's luck.
It's not luck. It's not luck. Go. Those tender perennials don't just stop in that warm border. They're here in the white garden. You look at the shrubs and the herbaceous sort of set the rhythm and the structure. But then the tender perennials more or less guarantee you that colour through a long part of the season. We've got things like the butylons. We've got our garanthemums. And then the nicotiana. And they just bounce their way through. I think it's really clever what they've done with the hedges, because they've not just used one block. They've left little windows, so you get a link into the next space. And I think you can do that even in the smallest of gardens, maybe with an archway, a couple of pieces of trellis. You might just want to hide a seat or frame a pot at the end of the garden, but it just helps create a little bit of mystery. And just when you think that there's no more space for tender perennials in this garden, Jackie and her team managed to squeeze a few more in. Look at this pot. Absolutely incredible, isn't it? They pop up all around the garden, and for me, they encapsulate what this garden is all about. Yes, there is a lot of work in those borders, but think about that on your terrace right the way through the summer months. Wouldn't that put a smile on your face? My mate was right about this garden. It is special, probably one of the best summer gardens I've ever seen, the design and the planting.
I do think that when we plant out the tender perennials and annuals, it feels like it's the door opening to summer. And let's hope that the coming months are filled with glorious flower and fragrance for all of us. And I hope you've enjoyed today's special programme celebrating all those glorious summer flowers that hopefully will be awaiting all of us in the months to come. And I'll be back here at Longmeadow at the same time next week. So until then, bye-bye.